What time is it where you are? And where are you listening from? If you find calm in long, slow science, consider subscribing to Fusion Science Sleeps. Tonight, we begin far before machines, before filters made of plastic and faucet-mounted nozzles, before labs and microscopes, when the act of drinking water was not a habit and but a gamble, because water for most of human history was not clean. It was cloudy, it was full of dirt, yes, but also of sickness. And yet people drank it because they had to. So how did they make it safe? How did they, without understanding, bacteria or toxins, figure out how to filter what they could not see to begin? We have to go back to the oldest riverbanks where the first humans kneeled. Early humans and first water sources. In prehistory, long before settled civilizations, humans moved with the water. They followed rivers, streams, and lakes, not just for drinking, but for survival in every sense. Water gave fish. Water drew animals. Water meant movement. But not all water was safe. Stagnant ponds, brackish pools, muddy swamps, all existed even then. And humans learned through slow and painful experience that some waters made you sick. Still, they had no tools, no filters, no flasks. So the earliest form of water filtration was selection, avoiding certain sources, preferring fast-moving streams, choosing highland springs over lowland puddles. In this sense, nature did the filtering. Through gravity, through rocks, through motion, clear water was trusted. Cloudy water was feared, but instinct was not always enough, and so began the quiet innovation. Clay pots and settling. One of the oldest and simplest techniques was settling. When water is left to sit, gravity pulls particles to the bottom. Silt, sand, mud, and even some insects slowly drop, leaving clearer water above. Ancient people learned this. They filled clay pots, large shallow bowls, or dug small settling basins near rivers, and they waited, sometimes hours, sometimes days. When the sediments had sunk, they would gently scoop from the top. It wasn't sterile, but it was clearer, safer. This slow patience wait was their first filter. Some even learned to double pour, once from the river into a pot, then again from pot to another vessel, leaving the heavy sediments behind each time. But water clarity doesn't mean purity. Invisible things remained. They just didn't know it yet. Sand and gravel filters. One of the earliest active filtration methods was surprisingly clever, using sand and gravel to mimic natural groundwater. In some ancient cultures, including Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and early Indian societies, people began to pour water through layered sand beds. They dig shallow basins, fill them with coarse gravel at the bottom, then medium sand, then finer sand on top. Water, when poured from above, would trickle down. The grains would trap solids, leaf bits, insect parts, even some microbes, and the water that reached the bottom, cleaner, tasted better, smelled less. This wasn't accidental. Places like the Indus Valley civilization, archaeologists have found evidence of engineered filtration basins attached to bathhouses and water collection areas. It wasn't just about bathing. It was about trust. People began to believe that filtered water, even if they didn't know why, made them healthier. The first water ethics were born. Charcoal. The ancient purifier, one of the most remarkable substances known to ancient people across many continents, was charcoal burnt wood. Black and dusty, may not look like a cleanser, but even without knowing chemistry, early humans saw what it did. Charcoal, when ground and used in small quantities, could absorb smells and clarify liquids. In India, as early as 2000 BCE, Ayurvedic texts described the use of charcoal filtering for purifying water. Water would be passed through charcoal-lined cloths or stored in charred wooden vessels. The result was clearer, fresher and less likely to cause illness. Charcoal works through adsorption, a process where particles stick to the surface of the material. Toxins, bacteria, and even bad smells cling to the millions of pores inside. Charcoal today, we use activated carbon filters, but the principle it was already in use 4,000 years ago. Boiling and the power of fire. Before filtration came, sterilization, or rather its accidental cousin. Fire, and perhaps the oldest human discovery, had many uses: warmth, cooking, defense, but it also became a purifier. When water from a suspicious source made people sick, some began to notice something. Water that had been heated, often by accident in a cooking pot, seemed less harmful. Over time, boiling became a habit in many places, especially in East Asian cultures, where tea culture further promoted it. In China, records from the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, describe boiling water for drinking. In Japan, monks in the Heian period were taught to heat all water before consumption. Boiling was the first true disinfection, long before microbes were discovered, and it likely saved millions. Cloth filtration, another quiet technology. Cloth, weather. Made of cotton, linen, or even silk, woven fabric became a tool for water cleansing. In many cultures, and including rural Africa, South Asia, and indigenous Americas, people began using folded cloth to strain water. Cloth doesn't remove chemicals, but it traps visible dirt. In Bangladesh, a tradition of folding sari cloth multiple times and placing it over a jar has been shown, even in modern studies, to reduce cholera bacteria by up to 48%. The weave traps plankton that host cholera bacteria. Even without knowing microbiology, people saw results. Cloth filters were portable, reusable, and essential during travel or floods. Even today, they're used in emergencies. Copper and silver vessels. In some ancient cultures, metals were more than wealth. They were medicine. The use of copper and silver vessels for storing drinking water has deep roots. In Ayurvedic India, it was believed that copper stored water balanced bodily energies. In Persia, silver was known to preserve water freshness during long storage. Today we understand why. Copper and silver have oligodynamic properties. They kill bacteria by disrupting cell membranes. Modern studies confirm it. Storing water in Mosintuan copper vessels for 8+ hours can reduce E. coli, cholera, and salmonella significantly. It wasn't magic. It was chemistry, and ancient people stumbled into it by careful observation. As human civilizations began to rise, the relationship between water and society deepened. Water was no longer just a necessity for the wanderer. It became the foundation of cities, empires, and belief systems. Where water flowed, life followed. But where water pooled, problems also grew. And so the story of ancient water filtration moved beyond household tricks and into large-scale systems, quiet, deliberate engineering marvels that carried, stored, and filtered water across entire cities, all without machines. It was a silent revolution. And in many ways, it still runs beneath us today. The filtration systems of the Indus Valley, among the oldest planned urban civilizations in human history, the Indus Valley Civilization c. 600–1900 BCE, we find not just cities but systems, In the cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, streets were aligned in grids, houses had bathrooms, and water was not an afterthought. It was central. Wells were dug, deep, brick-lined and privately accessible. Public baths, like the famous Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro, suggest communal cleansing, possibly even spiritual purification. But, more interestingly, waste and clean water were separated. Houses had drains which led to covered sewage systems. Rainwater was channeled through sloped streets, and some scholars believe they used settling tanks, early basins to remove sediments, from water before storage or use. Though we find no detailed writings, the architecture speaks. These people understood water behavior, and their systems, over 4,000 years old, are more organized than many modern slums today. They trusted the ground, but they designed around it. Egypt, Nile logic, and sans giftin. Ancient Egypt, water was everything. The Nile was not just a river, it was a calendar, a path, a god. But the Nile, and for all its life-giving floods, was also muddy, and when drawn for drinking it carried silt, fish debris and organic matter. So how did Egyptians clean it? They settled it, yes. They boiled it, often. But they also filtered. Using sand, one common practice was to dig shallow sand pits near the Nile's edge. Water from the river would percolate through the sand before being collected in jars. This natural sand filtration, known today as bank filtration, removes turbidity, reduces bacteria, and improves taste. Egyptians also used alum, a naturally occurring chemical, to help coagulate particles in the water. Though they didn't know the term coagulation, they observed, when crushed alum was mixed into muddy water, the dirt would clump, sink, and leave clearer water above. Alum or aluminum sulfate is still used in modern water treatment plants. The Nile gave them life, but their intelligence kept them healthy. Greek and Roman innovations, the Greeks and Romans, brought a new element to water management, scale. They didn't just settle water. They moved it, stored it, displayed it, and they cleaned it. Greek cities used cisterns, where rainwater collected from rooftops and flowed into underground chambers. Before entering the cistern, the water would often pass through gravel-lined channels, removing leaves, twigs, and dust from roofs. The Romans, however, took this even further. Their aqueducts, engineering marvels that still stand, brought water from distant springs, often traveling dozens of miles through gravity alone. But raw spring water could still be contaminated, so before it reached homes and fountains, Roman engineers designed settling tanks called castella. Water from the aqueduct would flow into these chambers where heavy particles would settle at the bottom. Only the upper layer flowed onward. Public fountains were fed from the top of these tanks. Bottom sludge was drained regularly. Additionally, some Roman baths featured sand beds, where hot and cold water was filtered before being used for immersion. They even used lead filters, though unknowingly this introduced toxic exposure over time. But their logic was sound. Let gravity do the work. Let the solids fall. Let only the clear water rise. China's subtle purity. In ancient China, especially during the Zhou and Han dynasties, water was both philosophical and medicinal. Taoist principles spoke of water's softness, its yielding nature, and its ability to cleanse. Practical water treatment was quietly embedded in life. Water was boiled before drinking, especially in tea culture. It was stored in clay jars lined with charcoal or herbs to improve flavor and clarity. Some Chinese communities placed oyster shells in storage vessels, a practice that unknowingly raised pH and reduced certain pathogens. In larger towns, rainwater harvesting systems were designed with tiled roofs, bamboo pipes, and cloth filters tied over inlet jars. The emphasis was not on flashy filtration systems, but on layered protection, heat, storage, herbal additives, filtration through cloth or charcoal. The mind of Chinese water logic was holistic. Purity wasn't just about dirt. It was about balance. The Islamic Golden Age, science meets water from the 8th to the 13th century CE, the Islamic world saw a scientific flourishing, especially in chemistry, medicine, and engineering. In the dry landscapes of the Middle, East, and North Africa, water was sacred. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus developed public water systems, fountains, irrigation channels, and household access. But they also experimented with filtration science. Islamic scholars like Al-Razi and Al-Zahrawi documented techniques to use ceramic vessels for filtering water, line water jars with charcoal, sand, and stones in layers, utilize fine cloth or silk for microbial removal. Many public mosques and schools had sables, public drinking water fountains, where water was often passed through gravel and charcoal, beds before use, and the religious practice of wudu, ritual washing, ensured water cleanliness wasn't just a personal preference, it was a spiritual duty. Filtering water became part of purification of the soul. Maya and the New World civilizations across the ocean, the Maya civilization of Central America, developed its own form of water engineering, surprisingly advanced. In places like Tikal, where the nearest water sources were far and rainfall was seasonal, Mayan engineers created large reservoirs lined with clay and stone. Recent archaeological studies have revealed something fascinating. Some of these reservoirs were lined with crystalline quartz sand and zeolite, a mineral with natural filtration and antibacterial properties. These materials would remove heavy metals and reduce turbidity. It is, arguably, the earliest known use of engineered water purification in the Americas. The reservoirs surrounded by ceremonial buildings suggest that clean water was not just functional, it was sacred. Africa. Wisdom in the well in many African societies, especially in sub-Saharan regions, the practice of water filtration varied widely, from desert oases to forest streams. One common method involved hollowed tree trunks or bamboo pipes filled with layered materials, charcoal fine sand gravel. Cloth water poured from one end would trickle out clean from the other. In some communities, banana stems were used, sliced, soaked, and packed into filters, leveraging their fibrous tissues to trap solids. Water was stored in calabash gourds, terracotta jars, or sun-baked pots, which cooled the liquid and sometimes provided mild filtration through their porous walls. In Ethiopia and Somalia, pastoral nomads would scoop water from muddy pools and pour it slowly through animal skins lined with linen, repeating the process several times. Water wisdom was mobile. It moved with the people, and it adapted to every climate. The wisdom of Fais. Observation all across ancient civilizations, one truth repeats. People learned to filter water not through microscopes, but through time they observed. They remembered. If a certain stream made a child sick, they marked it. If storing water in copper kept it fresh, they did it again. If sand made water taste better, they told their children. There were no sanitation. Textbooks, no infographics, no charts, just patterns and stories, and the slow layering of generational knowledge. As water passed from one container to another, from one culture to another, the human relationship with its clarity deepened. not just for survival but for symbolism. Clean water became a sign of health, but also of power, of purity, and sometimes of divinity. Filtration in these ancient times was rarely seen as technology. It was a ritual, a practice, a quiet rhythm that protected not only the body, but the memory of those who came before. In this next stretch of the ancient world, we drift into the sacred, into temples, hidden groves, and monastic systems where water's cleanliness reflected one's spiritual worth. The Hebrew tradition. Ritual and repetition. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, water was never merely physical. The mikveh, a ritual bath used for purification, demanded specific conditions. Natural water sources, such as springs, rainwater, or certain rivers, were required to maintain spiritual integrity. The water had to be living, that is, flowing. These baths were filled through rain collection systems and stone cisterns, many of which included rudimentary sand filters to remove large debris. Water used for drinking or washing also followed procedures, stored in ceramic or stone vessels, never mixed with unclean substances, and often settled before consumption. The logic was simple. Let time and gravity separate the clear from the cloudy, but the meaning ran deeper. Water cleansed not only the skin, but prepared the soul to reconnect with the divine. To filter water was to remove the world's noise before entering the presence of God. Monks and medieval filtering across early Christian monastic orders, particularly during the late Roman and early medieval periods, water became part of spiritual discipline. Monasteries were often built near rivers or natural springs, and the design of cloisters, channels, and covered aqueducts reflected a deep concern with keeping the water undefiled. Monks would pass water through gravel troughs or cloth-wrapped channels before storing it in underground cisterns carved into rock. In certain regions of Ireland and Wales, monks collected rainwater using dry stone collection platforms where water was gently filtered through lichen-covered stones and mossy cloths. The act of cleaning water wasn't seen as technical. It was part of asceticism, a way to reduce contamination, not just physical but mental and spiritual. Silence, stillness, and slow, careful stewardship of every drop. Japanese water traditions. Harmony and simplicity in ancient Japan. Water flowed not just through pipes, but through philosophy. The Shinto view of water as a purifier of sin and restorer of balance influenced everything from architecture to agriculture. In shrines, water was used for temaizu, the ritual washing of hands and mouth before prayer. This water often passed through bamboo channels lined with smooth pebbles and activated charcoal to purify both visibly and spiritually. In mountain monasteries, streams were diverted into wooden troughs where mosses, rocks, and sand slowed the flow and cleaned it gently. In more populated areas, rainwater collection from tiled rooftops was common, with filters made of woven reeds and ceramic basins to settle sediment. Tea masters, especially during the Heian and Edo periods, were particularly mindful. They stored water in kiln-fired jars, aged it, and filtered it through cotton cloth, knowing that even subtle mineral content could affect. The taste of tea water was not manipulated. It was guided, respected, and wherever possible, left to purify itself under watchful care. Inca innovations. Terraces and springs high in the Andes, the Inca civilization faced unique challenges: altitude, uneven terrain, and limited rainfall. Yet, their water management remains one of history's most quietly astonishing achievements. In cities like Machu Picchu, water from mountain springs was channeled across kilometers of stone-carved paths. Before reaching fountains or gardens, this water passed through multi-layered filtration boxes, built from gravel, sand, and porous rock. These served both structural and filtration purposes. They prevented sediment from clogging channels, removed organic matter, and cooled the water. In addition, agricultural terraces, built in layers, acted as natural filters. Rainfall and stream water would trickle down from one level to the next, passing through soil, clay, and root systems, gradually losing contaminants. For the Inca, water was sacred. They built shrines around springs, carved ceremonial fountains, and often placed carved stone vessels to catch the first drop, believing the initial water from the spring was the purest. Filtering water was aligning with nature, not resisting it. Bedouins and the desert's hidden filters. In the desert, water is scarce, precious, and almost always suspect. Among Bedouin tribes who roamed the Arabian and North African deserts, water filtration was a matter of deep tradition and constant observation. Water gathered from oases, wadi pools, or dew-covered plants was often filtered using wool or camel hair cloth wrapped multiple times and suspended like funnels. Goatskin bags, where sediment settled slowly at the bottom. Clay pots with small pores which filtered slowly and kept water cool. Charcoal sand cones, used to clarify any suspicious liquid after rainfall. But most fascinating was their use of sunlight. If water was especially murky or stagnant, they would pour it into shallow metal bowls and leave it under the sun, letting UV radiation, heat, and evaporation purify it subtly. The cleanest part, the condensate, was often collected on cloths or rocks, wiped off and used sparingly. Their tools were humble, but their awareness was exact. They knew what clouds meant, what wind direction foretold, what color a pool should be, and through this knowledge they refined water without filters, using the earth and sky as their laboratory. South Asian folk wisdom, from leaves to smoke. Across the villages of ancient India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, water flowed from rivers, monsoons, and deep wells. But the people knew, even water that looked clean could make you sick. So they passed wisdom orally, rituals passed from grandmother to grandchild. Use neem leaves or moringa seeds in water jars. These natural antibacterials helped prevent illness. Store water in copper vessels. Copper ions have antimicrobial properties, slowly neutralizing pathogens. Burn dry wood or cow dung near water pots. The smoke, rich in alkaline compounds, would sometimes settle in the vessel and purify its contents. Pour water through sari cloth, usually folded 4 times, to remove guinea worm eggs. This simple practice saved countless lives in regions where the parasite was endemic. These were not filters in the modern sense, they were ecosystem practices. Every village had its own method, every family its own combination, and water was judged not just by clarity, Mescat, but by memory. Where it came from, when it was drawn, how it smelled, how it tasted after 2 days in the pot. The science was primitive, but the results were often remarkable. Minoans and the island engineers on the Mediterranean island of Crete. The Minoan civilization, c. 3000 to 1100 BCE, achieved stunning levels of water management. At the Palace of Knossos, archaeologists discovered terracotta pipes with interlocking joints, the oldest known plumbing system in Europe. Rainwater was collected through stone channels, passed through filtration basins lined with small pebbles, and stored in large ceramic jars called pithoi. Some larger palaces used dual water systems, one for drinking, another for washing and ritual. By analyzing sediment layers, researchers concluded that the Minoans used natural filtration pits filled with alternating layers of volcanic ash, crushed shells, sand, charcoal, clay. This setup removed impurities while preserving minerals. Even their toilets were flushed with running water centuries before Rome. For an island civilization dependent on seasonal rainfall, every drop filtered was a victory against drought. Filtering. Through the memory of soil, from ice to ash, from moss to cloth, the people of the ancient world filtered water not with science degrees, but with humility toward nature. They watched how water moved through the earth. They mimicked what they saw in riverbeds, springs, and marshes, and so they learned. Sand softens the flow. Gravel holds the larger threats. Cloth clears the fog. Heat stills the invisible. Time does most of the work. In all these ways, the earth was not just their home, it was their filter. What time is it where you are? And where are you listening from? If you enjoy long, quiet journeys through the science of survival, the forgotten rituals of ancient life, and the slow rhythm of the past, then feel free to subscribe to Fusion. Science sleeps. There's always more to explore, and very, very slowly. Now we return to the long, soft trail of water. Roman aqueducts. More than just movement. The Romans didn't just move water. They purified it. Quietly, ingeniously, on a scale that would not be seen again for over 1,000 years. Aqueducts, those tall, graceful arches that still mark the skylines of ancient Europe, are often remembered for their engineering. But within those arches flowed water that had passed through a multi-stage cleansing ritual. Built into the stones themselves, water was first captured from mountain springs, the cleanest sources available. Then, as it flowed downhill through the terracotta or stone channels, engineers installed settling tanks at regular intervals. In these stone basins, heavy particles, sand, silt, and organic debris, would settle to the bottom. Some tanks were fitted with baffles, stone dividers that slowed the water, giving sediment more time to sink. Others were coated with plaster containing lime, which added mild antibacterial properties. At the end of the system, before water entered public fountains or private villas, it was often passed through sand pits, gravel beds, or fine mesh bronze. Screens, the goal, deliver water that didn't just flow but shimmered. Water that not only served citizens, but honored the gods. For in Rome, even cleansing was a civic and spiritual duty. Chinese dynasties layered knowledge of filtration in ancient China. From the Zhou dynasty to the Tang and Song periods, scholars and farmers alike developed thoughtful, consistent ways of purifying water. One of the most commonly used methods was ceramic filtration. Porous clay vessels baked at low temperatures naturally allowed water to pass through while trapping bacteria and sediment. This was combined with sand layers and sometimes lined with charcoal made from bamboo, a highly porous and absorbent substance still used today in many modern filters. By the Han Dynasty, some households used multi-tiered clay jars, the top containing raw water, the middle lined with burnt rice husks or ashes, and the bottom serving as the clean storage area. Larger systems were used in monasteries and rural towns, where water was directed through reed beds, gravel ditches, and even fish ponds, where aquatic plants helped break down organic waste. Confucian. Texts referenced the importance of clarity, not just in speech but in sustenance. Clean water was seen as the mirror of moral discipline. To maintain its purity was to maintain the harmony of the household and the state. Aboriginal Australians, filtering through landscape memory in the vast sun-baked stretches of Australia, Aboriginal peoples understood the land not as a challenge, but as a map. A deep sacred code passed from ancestor to ancestor. Waterholes were seasonal. Springs were hidden. But if you knew how to read the stars, the trees, and the shifting colors of the sand, you could find it. Once found, water was gently filtered using soaked bark bundles, spinifex grass filters, sand pits lined with crushed charcoal. More importantly, Aboriginal groups knew where not to drink, how to judge a sick spring, how to walk miles further if a pool had been disturbed by animals, how to collect dew from stone surfaces using animal skins. They spoke of the rainbow serpent, a mythical being tied to waterholes and rivers. To pollute water was to offend a living force. So even when filtration was minimal, the respect for source and season was everything. Indus Valley, the forgotten genius among the oldest urban civilizations known, the Indus Valley, centered around cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, was stunning in its quiet complexity. Their houses were connected to public drainage systems. Their streets featured brick-lined wells, and their baths collected runoff through grated stone filters. What historians uncovered shocked them: sediment traps, sluice gates, and even what appeared to be charcoal layers beneath water entry points. In Nunavut, some areas, small gravel-lined cisterns were placed adjacent to latrines, suggesting that filtered runoff might have been repurposed for irrigation or cleaning. The people of the Indus Valley didn't write much down, but they built their wisdom into bricks, and those bricks told us that they respected water as infrastructure, not magic, not mystery, but a reliable friend that needed care. Viking settlements, filters of ice and time. In the colder zones of northern Europe, Viking communities collected water from glacial streams, melted snow, and deep wells dug into permafrost. But cold didn't mean clean. They learned to store water in hollowed-out logs, where wood absorbed odors, filter snowmelt through layers of moss and ice, use birch bark funnels which had natural antiseptic oils, burn juniper branches near water containers to drive off pests and add subtle purification. Sometimes water was left out overnight in open clay bowls, where the cold would freeze the surface first, separating cleaner water from heavier sediment, which settled deeper. Even in silence and frost, they listened to water. They waited, and they watched the way ice revealed purity, the filtration logic of nature. When humans first filtered water, they didn't copy textbooks. They copied rivers. They observed what happened when water passed through pebble banks, reed thickets, algae mats, forest floors. They watched animals drink only after rain. They followed elephants to deeper pools. They noticed which streams sparkled after storms and which ones made people sick. From these patterns came practice. And even today, much of what we consider modern filtration, charcoal, ceramic, settling, biological treatment, is simply a refined form of what humans were doing 3,000 years ago, with nothing but patience and instinct. Water, filtered by culture, each civilization added its own layer. The Maya filtered through porous limestone and carved caves. The Celts used bundles of straw and leather to clean swamp water. The Persians built qanats, underground channels, that cooled, settled, and filtered water beneath the surface. The Egyptians combined sand and plant roots in wide stone basins. The Ethiopians strained river water through layers of woven cloth, often dyed with herbs. In each place, water became more than liquid. It became story, a teacher, a test. And filtering it was often the first sign that a society had begun to settle. Filtering wasn't just survival, it was identity. To cleanse water wasn't only to survive disease. It was to define what it meant to live with foresight. Clean water signaled care, discipline, observation, and over time water became how people measured themselves, not just by what they drank, but by what they refused to drink. In this stillness, in these ancient acts of patience, you begin to hear the long, slow pulse of human evolution, not in technology, but in awareness. Even when water was found and collected with care and observed over time, it still held within it dangers that could not be seen, invisible things, silent threats. And over generations, ancient people began to recognize that sometimes clarity was not enough. Water that looked clean could still bring sickness. And so they turned to new allies, not in the skies or rivers, but in the elements of fire, clay, and ash. These three materials, each born of transformation, became essential tools in the slow art of ancient water purification. Burned ash. The accidental discovery, when people began using fire to cook, they noticed something peculiar after. Rain, when water flowed through the ashes of old fire pits, it tasted different, sometimes softer, sometimes less sour, sometimes safer. Ash, especially from hardwood, is rich in alkaline minerals, primarily potassium carbonate and calcium oxide. These minerals, when mixed with water, raise the pH level slightly, making the environment less favorable for certain harmful microbes. Over time, people learned to add small amounts of wood ash into clay pots filled with collected rainwater. Stir gently, let it sit, allow heavier sediment and ash residue to sink. Scoop only the upper layer. This was especially common in regions of sub-Saharan Africa, where water collected from open pools had high organic content. Ash didn't just purify, it also helped neutralize odors and bind to impurities through simple ionic interactions. This process, rudimentary and imperfect, would later evolve into modern alkaline treatment methods used in municipal plants. Clay, nature's molecular sieve in ancient Anatolia, Egypt, and parts of early Mesoamerica. People began to notice something strange about clay pots. If left unglazed, these vessels did more than hold water. They changed it. Water stored in raw earthen pots emerged clearer, cooler, sometimes even free of the usual earthy smells. The secret was in the structure. Clay, when fired at low temperatures, retains a microporous network of capillaries. Water seeps through, very slowly, while larger particles, protozoa, and even some bacteria are held back. This is now known as ceramic filtration, and modern science confirms what the ancients practiced. A properly formed ceramic pot can reduce E. coli and cryptosporidium contamination by up to 90 to 99%, especially when combined with charcoal coatings or silver impregnation. In ancient use, these filters were often slow, producing only a few liters per day, but that was enough because it wasn't about speed, it was about trust in the vessel, and patience in the process. Fire, not just for warmth. The single most effective method of water purification in the ancient world was also the simplest. Boiling, used across every known culture, from the icy coasts of Inuit tribes to the equatorial jungles of the Amazon. Boiling water became the universal fallback when other methods failed, but it wasn't always easy. In many regions, fuel was scarce. Firewood had to be gathered, dried, and rationed. Boiling a full pot of water took time and effort and smoke. So people adapted, Hot stones were placed into water-filled animal bladders or wooden bowls, heating them indirectly. Small bamboo containers were used in Southeast Asia to boil water over open flame. Clay kettles were designed with narrow necks to reduce evaporation loss during long boils. They learned to watch for the rolling bubble, not the first flicker of steam. And they learned that even half a minute at full boil could mean the difference between sickness and survival. Today, boiling remains the WHO recommended method in emergencies, but for the ancients, it wasn't emergency science. It was routine, woven into daily rhythm, just another fire lit for life. Combining the methods, layered thinking in. Some of the most advanced ancient communities, we find evidence of multi-stage purification systems. Take, for example, the Zapotec people of pre-Columbian Mexico. In mountain settlements, they would catch rainwater using carved stone gutters, pass the water into a sedimentation basin lined with sand and small pebbles, transfer to ceramic jugs containing a layer of charred corncob ash and cooled clay chips, and finally, store the water in sealed clay containers, some of which were partially buried to stay cool. Similar systems were used in Nabatean desert towns, where cisterns were treated with lime Persian gardens, where water from qanats passed, through reed beds Balinese compounds where water was filtered through volcanic sand. In all cases, the principle remained consistent. Layer by layer, step by step, hazard by hazard, they filtered not only water, but uncertainty observation. Was the first technology. When we think of filtration today, we imagine machines, screens, chemicals, pressure gauges. But ancient water science was quiet science, done with eyes, ears, patience. A healer in a Syrian village would smell water and know if algae had bloomed. A mother in Korea would tilt a clay bowl and listen for irregular flow. An elder in Nepal would watch children drink from a stream and wait a day before deciding if it was safe. They didn't need graphs. They had generations of observation, and filtration wasn't separate from life. It was embedded in routine. Draw water, filter through memory, test with time, share with trust, biological filtration, using life to clean. Life, though less understood at the time, many ancient cultures accidentally practiced what we now call biological filtration. That is, using plants, microorganisms, and natural substrates to break down contaminants. In India, sacred groves near temples were irrigated with water that first flowed through lotus ponds, where root systems absorbed nitrates and heavy metals. In the Andes, algae mats in highland lakes reduced organic waste. In parts of Africa, water was passed through living reed beds, whose roots hosted bacteria that digested waste materials. None of these were labeled biofilters, but they worked, and over centuries, trial and error taught communities to build with nature, not against it. Why ancient filtration still matters because we think we've moved on. We haven't. Modern filtration systems, from Berkey filters to reverse osmosis units, still rely on pressure, sediment capture, activated carbon, and biological remediation, all of which were being used 3,000 years ago. The tools have changed, the core has not, and perhaps what's most remarkable is not that the ancients learned how to clean water, but that they did it without seeing the threats they were removing. No microscopes, no bacterial theory, only intuition, and the unshakable knowledge that water could be both blessing and risk. To clean water was to become human. In filtering water, humans filtered time. They filtered mistakes, Filtered guesswork, filtered what was harmful and preserved what sustained, and over centuries, the process of filtration became less about removing debris and more about remembering who we are: observers, listeners, healers, carriers of quiet knowledge. Long before water was studied in laboratories, before it was piped, pumped, and chemically analyzed, it was honored, revered, approached not as a resource, but as a force, a being. In many parts of the ancient world, water was filtered not just through clay or ash, but through ritual, belief, and behavior. Because before filtration was formalized as a mechanical task, it was practiced as something deeper, a sacred exchange, a human responsibility, and often a spiritual contract. Springs that healed and springs that warned across every continent, ancient peoples identified certain springs as living, places where water emerged from the earth with unusual clarity, coolness, or consistency. They weren't always clean by modern standards, but they were consistent, predictable, and that mattered. In ancient Greece, springs dedicated to nymphs were believed to carry divine qualities. The Castalian spring, near Delphi, was said to grant purification to those who bathed in it before entering the oracle's temple, not because its mineral content was measured, but because generations had bathed there and felt restored. In India, kunds, stepped wells fed by underground aquifers, were considered sacred. They were cleaned ritually. Leaves were skimmed off daily. Offerings were made not just to the gods, but to the water itself. This behavior, approaching water with caution and ceremony, created an early system of protection. It discouraged pollution, encouraged observation, and ensured that the sources people returned to remained viable. If a spring changed taste, it was noted. If it dried early, it became a warning. Water was not just drunk, it was watched. Filtration, through faith and structure. Religious architecture often included built-in water management systems that also functioned as purification stages. In ancient Islamic architecture, for example, many mosques had sables, public fountains where water was poured through marble channels or copper basins. While intended for ritual cleansing, these basins often served a dual purpose: aerating the water as it fell, filtering it through gravel-lined bases, cooling it through contact with stone. In Buddhist monasteries, particularly in Tibet and China, monks placed large ceramic bowls under dripping cave springs. The water was allowed to settle for days. Impurities drifted to the bottom. Only the clear layer was drawn, using cups that never touched the base sediment. This wasn't described as science, but it was. It was sedimentation. It was controlled exposure. It was time as a filter. Cultural rules that preserved water quality. Some of the earliest forms of filtration weren't physical systems, they were social behaviors. In many ancient cultures, rules around who could draw water, how and when were strictly maintained. Examples include, in Zulu villages, only older women were allowed to collect morning water from sacred pools. They were trained to watch for changes in smell, texture, or animal tracks near the edge. In rural Japan, homes were arranged in a cascade system, with kitchen use upstream, animal washing downstream, and ritual purification at separate, untouched springs. In early Celtic settlements, entire forests were marked as taboo zones near river sources, forbidden to cut, hunt, or settle in, so the water remained untouched. These taboos acted as invisible filtration systems. They preserved buffer zones prevented cross-contamination, and enforced ecological restraint long before that phrase existed. Filtering through fire and time, charcoal's silent role among the most remarkable early tools for purification, one that still exists in modern systems, was charcoal, ancient. People may not have known why it worked, but they knew it did. In parts of West Africa, South Asia, and the Amazon, water was stored in vessels where charred wood was placed at the bottom. Why? The water stayed cooler. The taste improved and illnesses declined. We now know that activated charcoal has a vast surface area at the microscopic level, ideal for absorbing toxins, organic compounds, and even some pathogens. By chance or by careful memory, ancient communities discovered that burned matter, once dead, could bring life back to water. Charcoal also neutralized chlorine-like odors, trapped sediment in micropores, and reduced microbial load significantly. In ancient Sri Lanka, temple tanks were periodically burned and refilled, with layers of ash and sand acting as a biological and mechanical filter. This wasn't labeled carbon filtration, but it worked that way, and it worked for centuries. Filtration in moving water, the power of flow. Not all water needed to be stored. Sometimes it just needed to be channeled. In Maya cities, narrow aqueducts and stone-lined channels were built with tight curves and settling pools, forcing water to slow down, change direction, and drop sediment naturally. In ancient Rome, the Aqua Virgo aqueduct passed through long underground paths. This gave time for large particles to settle, microbial activity to decline, and for water to remain cool, less conducive to bacterial growth. These systems weren't sealed. They weren't pressurized, but they were structured to let gravity and time do the filtering. And people knew, still water gathers disease, flowing water cleanses, but too much flow carries debris. Balance was the method. Filtering through sand and silence. Among the oldest and most effective passive filters was the sand bed. Whether in deserts, forests, or river plains, humans discovered that water passed through layers of sand, gravel, and fine silt came out different. This method, known today as slow sand filtration, was used in ancient India, where wells were often lined with sand, and water passed through multiple chambers before reaching storage Arab settlements, where reed baskets were filled with sand and allowed to sit in cisterns. Andes communities, where water from mountain melt flowed across terraced sand beds before collection. Why sand? It trapped pathogens and parasites. It removed turbidity and, when undisturbed, formed a biolayer of microorganisms that consumed harmful bacteria. This natural biological activity, invisible, slow, but steady, protected entire generations. The role of memory and repetition filtering water wasn't always active. It was embedded in stories, rituals, songs, and calendar cycles. In Papua New Guinea, families taught children to fetch water only after the first light but before midday, when surface contamination was lowest. In Mongolia, elders recited water proverbs every season, reminders to watch for algae, to avoid grazing animals upstream, and to wait after storms. And in the deserts of Jordan, Bedouin families followed stars to time their movement to next wells, knowing when a pool had rested long enough to clear naturally. These stories weren't myths. They were filtration protocols passed down in words, and they worked because when you can't see danger, you must remember it. The hidden genius of simplicity. Modern filters come with manuals, LEDs, lifespan counters, but ancient filters had no expiration, no certifications. They worked because they were observed. They were respected, and they were repeated: clay, ash, sand, charcoal, time. Each one contributed to a civilization that learned through failure and passed down through success. Not every method was perfect, but perfection wasn't the goal, survival was. And over thousands of years, humanity survived not by mastering water, but by learning to listen to it. Rain was not always a blessing. Sometimes it brought danger, because while clean, fresh water from the sky may seem pure, the first water that touched the earth often became dirty within seconds. It picked up dirt, animal waste, plant debris, ash from fires, sometimes even decomposing matter. Ancient civilizations quickly learned this pattern, and they adapted, with methods not just to collect rain, but to filter it before it ever entered storage. The concept of first flush. Many communities across time recognized something important: the initial moments of a rainstorm, especially after a long, dry period, carried the most contaminants. In modern terminology, this is called first flush diversion. But it is not new. In ancient Middle Eastern towns, stone channels leading from rooftops or courtyards included gates or small basins. The first 5 to 10 minutes of rainfall were allowed to flow freely out, washing the dust, bird droppings, and leaves away. Only when the water ran visibly clear was it allowed to enter storage cisterns or clay jars. Similarly, in southern India, families placed palm leaves across roof edges during the start of a storm. These deflected the first rain onto the ground, then were removed after a few minutes so that the rest could flow into collection pots. They didn't use words like turbidity or fecal coliform. But they knew the first water is never the best water. Terrace systems and gravity filtering beyond rooftops, entire landscapes were sometimes sculpted to purify rainwater. In South America, especially within Andean civilizations, large terraced fields were not only for farming, they also served as natural water filters. When rainfall occurred, it entered the top terrace, which was filled with gravel, allowing the water to settle and slow. As water passed downward, to the next terrace it moved through sand, which removed suspended particles. Lower terraces often contained clay or loam, which held the water longer, further clarifying it. Finally, it reached a collection pond, where only the top layer was drawn for drinking. This multi-tiered approach mimicked the filtration found in natural wetlands, and it required no machinery, only observation and patience. Cisterns as passive. Filters storing water underground helped protect it from evaporation and surface contamination. But ancient cisterns were not just holes in the ground. Many were deliberately designed to filter and settle water before it was used. In Jerusalem, during the First Temple period, large hewn rock cisterns were carved with sloped floors, guiding sediment to one end. The intake pipe would sit slightly above the sediment layer, ensuring only the clear water from the upper level was drawn. Some cisterns in ancient Crete included small charcoal-lined pits before the main tank, allowing water to trickle through ash before settling. In North Africa, underground water chambers often used limestone filtration grates, which caught larger particles and offered mild chemical filtration through natural mineral reaction. These systems were all passive. They relied on gravity, time, and natural materials. Yet some remained functional for centuries and can still be found in archaeological sites today. Filtering rainwater in nomadic cultures for nomads carrying filtration tools wasn't always possible, but even in constant motion, people developed methods to separate clean water from contaminated sources. In Bedouin traditions, Rainfall collection involved spreading goat hair blankets on the sand. When rain fell, the first flow was absorbed by the sand. The next layer filtered through the blanket. Water was collected underneath in a shallow dug basin lined with clay or leather. The blanket acted as a silt filter, catching debris and insects. Sand absorbed oils and surface pollutants. Afterward, the blanket was rinsed and sun-dried, sterilized by the desert heat. No plastic, no boiling, just rhythm. And resourcefulness. In Mongolian herding cultures, water was often filtered through felted wool, coiled into a basket and placed over wooden troughs. The fine mesh of the wool removed sediment. The troughs were shaded to reduce bacterial growth from sunlight, all done on the move. All done by memory. Clay pots with built-in filtration. Clay wasn't just used for storage, it often filtered water actively. In pre-Columbian Central America, porous clay vessels were made with microscopic holes small enough to allow water through, but large enough to block debris and some microorganisms. Sometimes the clay was mixed with organic materials like rice husk or sawdust, which burned away during firing, leaving tiny channels behind. These filters were refillable, reusable, and often shaped with narrow necks to reduce contamination from hands or cups. In modern times, similar ceramic filters are being rediscovered in low-resource areas, modeled directly on these ancient designs. They work because they already worked thousands of years ago. Constructed wetlands and biofiltration. Some ancient settlements, especially in tropical or marshy regions, turned their entire environment into a filtration tool. In parts of Southeast Asia, constructed wetlands were designed with reed beds to trap large particles, gravel zones for sedimentation, floating plants that absorbed nutrients and reduced algae, shallow basins to allow UV light penetration, killing pathogens. These wetlands weren't gardens. They were engineered deliberately to purify. People knew how to build the flow, where to plant the sedge, how deep to dig. The water that emerged downstream was cleaner, cooler, safer. Personal filters, sand in gourds and bark cups, while large community systems are well documented, personal filtering was also practiced, often using tools made from whatever was nearby. In Amazonian villages, travelers sometimes used hollowed gourds filled with coarse sand, charcoal powder, and a soft leaf layer on top rainwater or stream water was poured in. It trickled through slowly, dripping out the bottom over several minutes. In northern Europe, birch bark funnels were packed with moss and fine gravel, used to filter stream water on the go. These personal filters weren't as thorough as modern systems, but they reduced visible contaminants, cooled the water, and made it drinkable more often than not, especially when there was no time to build a full system, or when one mouth needed water now. Observation. Before filtration, one of the most underrated tools of ancient water purification wasn't a material or a system, it was the eye. Before collecting water, ancient people were trained to observe. Was the water flowing or still? Were there insects or algae? Did animals drink from it or avoid it? Was there foam, color, or smell? In ancient China, some Taoist healers taught apprentices to ask the water, to watch its reaction to touch, to light, to sound. They learned to see how sediment settled, how reflection moved, how air bubbles clung to surface oils. This wasn't superstition. It was pre-scientific field testing, and it saved lives. When filtration wasn't enough, boiling and beyond, despite all these systems, filtration wasn't always trusted on its own. In colder regions where fuel was abundant, boiling was often the final step. In early Slavic cultures, families maintained a constant fire urn where water was gently heated before drinking. In Tibetan monasteries, yak dung fires were used to boil snowmelt before use. In Aztec society, clay vessels were left in the sun for hours after filtering, using solar disinfection without knowing the term. These processes weren't consistent everywhere. They depended on fire, fuel, time, but the logic remained clear. Water is not always safe water, and fire clarified both spirit and stream. From the sky to the cup, every drop of rain began its journey pure. But the earth complicated it, and humans, with observation, patience, and quiet genius, simplified it again. They built channels, lined jars, memorized flows, watched sediment, and in doing so they created something lasting, a relationship with water, not just as a thing to consume, but as something to understand, respect, and prepare for, because water filtered the body. But knowledge filtered the water. Not all water was treated the same. Some was just for drinking, some for cleaning, but some water, some very specific water, held deeper meaning, and that meaning often shaped how it was collected, handled, and filtered. Across cultures and centuries, people assigned sacredness to water, springs that bubbled in silence, rivers that never dried, wells that never soured. But sacred didn't mean untouched. Sacred water was still cleaned, not to make it potable, but to prepare it for ritual. This section explores how spiritual beliefs merged with primitive hygiene, and how ritual water filtration may have been the world's first attempt at standardized water safety. Temple waters and layered sand pools. In ancient Mesopotamia, temple courtyards often featured small basins or pools where ritual purification took place. These weren't decorative. They were carefully constructed, fed by aqueducts that traveled miles underground, lined with layers of fine sand and silt, contained overflow channels to remove debris-laden surface water. The priests who bathed in these pools before sacrifices or divination were not just participating in ritual. They were being exposed to some of the most clean, filtered water in the city. Even the priests did not wash in the same water twice. Each basin was often drained and replenished after use. The water's journey from distant hills to inner sanctum became a metaphor for purity, both physical and spiritual. Ganges and flowing sanctity. In India, the Ganges River has been considered sacred for millennia. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to bathe in it, to drink from it, to have their ashes scattered in it. But even here, early Hindus developed a sense of which parts of the river were safest. In Varanasi, ancient water engineers understood that fast-flowing midstream water was cleaner. Areas downstream from cremation ghats were ritually avoided for drinking. Morning was better than evening, before the day's activities muddied the banks. And while large-scale filtration wasn't practiced, individual families often filtered Ganges water using woven cloth sand funnels, charcoal pots. It wasn't just reverence. It was reverence with understanding. Sacred didn't mean reckless. They believed the Ganges could purify sin, but they also knew that even holy water could carry dirt. Jewish mikvahs and water source laws. The mikvah, a Jewish ritual bath, was among the most detailed water purification systems in the ancient world, not because it used complex tools, but because of its legal structure. Ancient Jewish law dictated the water must be naturally collected, rain, spring, or stream only. No buckets, no pumping. The bath must hold a minimum volume, about 40 seah, or roughly 200 gallons. The first water collected must not be drawn by hand. Because of these rules, mikveh builders became hydrological architects. Rain was channeled from rooftops into stone reservoirs. Sediment was separated in secondary basins before reaching the main bath. Filters weren't mechanical. They were design choices, like overflow lips, sloped floors, and gravity-fed systems. Water was not chlorinated. It was not boiled, but it was regulated, and that regulation led to cleaner, safer water, used to cleanse hands, utensils, bodies, and souls. Christian baptismal pools and fountain hygiene. Early Christian baptistries, especially in the Eastern Roman Empire, were built not just for immersion but for purity. In Byzantine churches, large indoor or semi-covered baptismal pools were fed by aqueduct-filtered water from mountain springs, occasionally perfumed with natural antiseptics like frankincense or rose oil, cleaned after each use, especially during mass baptisms on holy days. Later, in medieval Europe, as public hygiene declined, the church became one of the only institutions to maintain functional fountains. These fountains were typically fed by distant spring pipelines, diverted through stone filtering chambers and lead-lined basins, lead unfortunately being misunderstood at the time. Even then, the knowledge persisted. Sacred water must be clear, flowing, and untouched by decay, a lesson rooted in health, masked as theology. Shinto shrines and stone basins. In Shinto tradition, the act of purification, called misogi, often involves rinsing the mouth and hands at shrine entrances. This is done at temizuya, stone basins filled with flowing water. Even in pre-modern Japan, these basins were fed by hidden channels from higher ground springs, built with slow overflow to prevent stagnation, occasionally filtered through volcanic rock beds for cooling and clarity. The ladles used were wooden, replaced regularly to prevent mold. The water wasn't sterilized, but it was carefully maintained. Ritual purity was mirrored in natural simplicity and in the subtle filtration provided by stone, slope, and stillness. African sacred groves and stream respect. Among certain West African cultures, sacred groves were protected forested areas where deities were believed to dwell. Within these groves, small streams or springs were used for both spiritual and physical cleansing. Traditional priests taught, never draw water from the first pool after a storm, it was too cloudy. Always take water upstream, never downstream of human footprints. Use woven sieves of grass and bark to catch insects and leaves. The water was respected, not treated, but it was treated with respect. In some traditions, animals were forbidden from drinking in these streams, not because of pollution fears, but to preserve the natural filtration of calm, plant-lined banks. The role of charcoal in ritual water. Across several traditions, charcoal found a place in water cleansing. In Vedic rituals, priests sometimes stored water in jars lined with wood ash, not realizing they were removing impurities using carbon filtration. In Zulu communities, burnt branches were stirred into communal water pots, both to bless and to cleanse. In Amazonian shamanic rites, water passed through burnt palm filters before ceremonial use. Charcoal was sacred, charcoal was purifying, but it was also practical. The tiny pores of carbon absorbed bacteria, tannins, and smells. Long before, activated charcoal became a term in Western health stores, public ritual and shared responsibility. In societies where ritual water was shared publicly, such as in festivals, ablutions, or blessings, there emerged early forms of social filtration behavior. In Roman times, public fountains were designed to flow constantly, avoiding standing water, be sourced from distant springs, avoiding city runoff, use stone or bronze basins to limit bacterial growth. People were taught, don't wash feet in the drinking stream, don't let cups touch the spout, draw water with clean hands or use communal ladles. These weren't just etiquette, they were proto-hygiene, and they helped reduce spread of disease in societies that had no word for germs. Summary of sacred filtration practices. So, what do all these rituals, Jewish, Hindu, African, Christian, Shinto, have in common? They treated water with a dual identity. Something to cleanse and something to be cleansed. They knew water could carry blessings, but they also knew it could carry harm. And from that tension came systems, stone filters, sand traps, cloth sieves, rain channels, charcoal jars. It was never just religion, it was experience. Passed down, refined, practiced again. Even when they prayed, they filtered. Even when they purified the water first. While temples, shrines, and public spaces often had complex water systems built for large gatherings or rituals, the majority of human life has always happened inside homes, in quiet corners of villages, in open courtyards, or behind wooden doors. And so the question arises, how did ordinary people in everyday households manage the water they drank, cooked with, or gave to children? They didn't have wells 30 feet deep, or the funding to build sedimentation tanks. They didn't have priests directing aqueducts. But what they had, everywhere from ancient Syria to Peru to Indus Valley kitchens, was cleverness. This section explores the small-scale, often forgotten but quietly effective domestic water filtration systems that helped humanity survive for millennia. The clay pot filter systems. Let's begin in the kitchen. Not the stainless steel kitchens of today, but the mud-lined open-fire kitchens of ancient homes in Asia and Africa. In many of these homes, water was kept in large clay jars, sometimes with lids, sometimes not. These weren't just storage containers. They were passive filters. Here's how. The clay itself was porous, slowly allowing water to seep through its walls, leaving behind larger particles. In many regions, such as ancient Nigeria and India, a two-pot system was used. One pot, on top for raw water, one below to catch the drips. Between the pots, villagers placed a layer of fine gravel or coarse sand. Over time, this system would remove sediment, leaves, microbes, to a small degree. Insects, the water wasn't sterile, but it was noticeably clearer than what came straight from the stream, and that mattered, especially for children. The charcoal sandcloth triangle. In ancient Southeast Asia and parts of Mesoamerica, a curious three-stage method emerged, not in temples, not in markets, but in homes. It combined charcoal from cooking, fires, sand from riverbanks, cloth woven from local fibers. Here's how the system worked. Water was poured through a cloth, tied around the mouth of a gourd or pot. This removed visible particles, dirt, bugs, leaves. It was then filtered through a column of sand, often packed inside a hollowed bamboo stalk or pottery tube. Finally, it passed over a bed of crushed charcoal, placed at the base of the container. Each stage removed a different kind of impurity. The cloth took out the large, visible pieces. The sand removed finer particles and some microbes. The charcoal absorbed smells and chemicals. The water was still untreated by modern standards, but it was drinkable. And, importantly, it was trusted. Water filtering baskets and sieves in. Parts of ancient China. people living near swamps or marshes, often used woven bamboo baskets to help cleanse their water. These weren't filters in the way we imagine today, but they served a similar purpose. Here's what they did. Baskets were woven tightly with fine reed fibers, creating a mesh. The basket was lined with coarse silk or felted wool, both available to even modest families. Water from rivers or ponds was scooped and poured slowly through these lined baskets. The results? A significant reduction in organic material, fewer floating larvae and bugs, a sense of psychological assurance, the E. Water had been cleaned. In colder regions, families would boil water after filtering, especially in winter, but in warmer climates the filtered water was often left to settle in clay pots overnight before drinking. Settling and decanting, one of the oldest and most widespread filtration strategies used from the Bronze Age to today, is called settling. It requires no tools, no materials, just time. Here's how it worked. Water was collected in a wide, shallow basin, often carved into stone or pressed into clay. It was left undisturbed for hours, sometimes overnight. Sediment, mud, and organic particles slowly sank to the bottom. The top water, now clearer, was gently poured off into another container. This technique is passive. It doesn't remove bacteria, but it does reduce visible contamination and turbidity. In desert cultures, especially among the Bedouins and Berber tribes, this was the only practical method available, and it was often paired with cloth filtering, or light boiling when firewood was available. Herbal and natural additives. Here's a surprising fact. Many ancient households added natural substances to their water, not to flavor it, but to cleanse it. Some examples: moringa seeds, used in parts of East Africa and India, contain proteins that bind impurities and help them sink. Neem leaves, when soaked in water, were believed to reduce microbial load, a claim now backed by some studies. Cinnamon bark and clove pods in Southeast Asia were added to kill germs, especially during the monsoon season. These additives had to be used carefully. Some families overused bitter herbs and made the water undrinkable. But in the right quantities, these plant-based additions acted as primitive antimicrobial agents, helping families stay healthier during seasons of sickness. Cooling as filtration. Proxy, another often overlooked aspect of domestic water hygiene in ancient homes, was cooling. In many cultures, especially in India, Persia, and Greece, water was stored in porous earthen pots, often called matkas, amphorae, or sieves. These pots weren't just containers, they were temperature regulators. As water seeped slowly through the micropores of clay, it evaporated on the outer surface, cooling the water inside. But more than that, the slow seepage helped clarify the water. Bacteria reproduction slowed at lower temperatures, and water kept in the dark inside clay pots stayed safer longer. This wasn't filtration per se, but it was effective water management, especially before the era of glass or sealed containers. Household boiling techniques. Boiling is often considered the ultimate water purification technique. And yes, it kills bacteria, but historically, not everyone had the fuel or fireproof containers to boil water regularly. In many ancient homes, water was heated in metal pots if available, and then cooled in clay jars. In places like Japan, tea rituals ensured water was always boiled before drinking. In Roman kitchens, heated stones were dropped into water-filled vessels to achieve a boil. However, boiling was often reserved for babies, for the sick, or during outbreaks. Most households combined light filtration with settling and boiled only when necessary. Social knowledge and intergenerational training One of the most powerful tools for water safety in ancient households wasn't a tool at all. It was memory, passed down by mothers, aunts, and elders. Don't drink from the river during the rain. Let the water settle before you cook. Change the cloth on the pot every week. Add charcoal after a sickness in the house. These weren't scientific statements, but they were effective protocols based on lived experience, observation, and oral tradition, and they formed the invisible filtration system that kept villages alive. Rural versus urban approaches. In rural areas, water came from wells, streams, or rain catchers. It was filtered on site with cloth, gravel, charcoal. Containers were washed weekly, sometimes with ash or vinegar. In cities, households were often dependent on public cisterns, aqueducts, or vendors. Water was filtered at home again, often due to contamination during transit. Boiling was more common due to higher disease exposure. Despite these differences, the core behaviors remained consistent. Clarity was desirable. Still, water was suspicious. Flowing water was safest, unless it had passed through hands. From households to history. So much of history focuses on kings, temples, wars. But here, in the quiet work of mothers filtering water with worn cloth and charcoal, is where human survival happened. These domestic systems weren't flashy. They weren't scientific papers. But they worked, and over thousands of years. They built the foundation of our modern water science. From village courtyards to desert tents to mud huts and wooden homes, the daily act of filtering water kept children alive, cooked food safe, and illnesses at bay, and all without the word filtration ever being spoken. In ancient times, water was not merely a necessity, it was a symbol, a boundary, and a sacred presence. Where logic and ritual converged, the filtration of water became more than just a hygienic measure. It became an act of devotion, a preparation for spiritual purity, and a medium between the earthly and the divine. This section explores how religious and ceremonial practices influenced the ways ancient cultures filtered and handled water, with methods that were often ahead of their time, rooted in both belief and observable health outcomes. Water as a purifying force. Nearly every ancient civilization recognized water as a purifier, not only of the body, but of the soul. In Hinduism, water was essential in daily rituals, and specific rivers like the Ganges were considered sacred, despite their turbidity. Yet before use in rituals, water was often drawn from upstream or from designated stone cisterns that allowed sediment to settle. In Zoroastrianism, water, abe, was one of the purest elements, and followers were instructed to protect it from contamination. Rituals involving water required it to be taken only from clean, running sources, which was often allowed to rest and settle before use. In ancient Egypt, water from the Nile was considered life-giving, but ritual water was often filtered through fine linen cloths, then stored in clean ceramic jars before temple use. These examples reveal that while divine power was attributed to water, people also intuitively understood that cleaner water was more effective in maintaining health, even if the language they used to describe it was spiritual rather than microbial. Temple reservoirs and filtration pools. Some of the earliest structured water filtration methods can be observed in temple architecture, where water had to meet both sacred and practical standards. In ancient Mesopotamia, temples often had basins or pools that received water from elevated channels. The water was directed through a series of gravel and sand-filled channels or perforated clay containers, which allowed debris to settle before reaching the main cleansing pool. In Minoan Crete, Archaeological findings in sites like Knossos reveal cisterns and clay piping systems that included screens and silt traps. These helped remove impurities before the water was used in ritual washing or temple activities. In South India, temple tanks or pushkarini were built with carefully layered stone steps and sloped sediment zones. Water from nearby springs or rain channels was led through small silt-catching inlets. Although not filtration in the modern sense, the system managed to separate cleaner water for upper use and allowed mud and waste to sink to the bottom. In these sacred spaces, the intention was not just to provide access to water, but to ensure its purity through both engineering and reverence. Holy water. Filtration in early Christianity and Judaism, in early Christian and Jewish traditions, ablutions, cleansing rituals and blessings, all involved water that had to be symbolically and visibly clean. In Second Temple Judaism, the use of mikvahs, ritual baths, required water from natural sources, but the cisterns often incorporated stone settling tanks where incoming water would be allowed to rest, removing sediment before usage. These tanks were often built in tiers, allowing upper levels to hold the cleanest water. Overflow from lower, dirtier tanks would drain out, ensuring the water used for purification met both religious and practical expectations. In Byzantine churches, fonts for baptism were carved from smooth stone and filled from collected rainwater or wells. The rainwater was directed through fine screen meshes or cloth filters at entry points, ensuring that debris such as leaves, twigs, and bird droppings were kept out. Even in symbolic cleansing, physical purity was not ignored. Islamic innovations. Ablution and water filtering in Islamic civilization. Water purification became both a legal requirement and a technological driver. For prayers and rituals, Muslims must perform wudu, a specific method of washing. Because of this, Islamic societies placed strong emphasis on clean, flowing water, and in cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Damascus, elaborate aqueducts, filters, and settling basins were installed both in mosques and public hammams, baths. Some notable filtration-related innovations included sand and gravel traps in public fountains, often underground, that removed debris before water reached surface. Taps, use of layered cloth sieves inside ablution fountains to prevent insects or organic matter from being stored in reservoirs. Cisterns with ceramic or terracotta filters, known as salsabiles, that allowed only the top portion of stored water to be dispensed. This focus on cleanliness was reinforced by religious texts, but it also resulted in practical designs that protected communities from waterborne illnesses, particularly during the medieval period when such diseases were common in Europe. Sacred wells and ritual filtering in Celtic and Germanic pagan traditions. Sacred wells were believed to possess healing powers. These wells were often protected, cleaned, and filtered, even if unintentionally, by the use of stone linings, sediment basins, or wooden troughs that filtered sediment by way of repeated overflow. In India, step wells, known as baolis or valves, functioned similarly. Pilgrims and villagers used the upper steps where the water was clearer and sediment had not yet settled. Cloth filtering was common here too, with fabric stretched across vessels to catch particulates, a practice seen in art dating back thousands of years. These religious traditions helped preserve early forms of basic filtration, encouraging their maintenance over generations due to their sacred associations. Ritual use of alum and natural coagulants. Some temples and religious institutions also experimented, knowingly or unknowingly, with early chemical purification. Techniques. In India and Africa, alum stones were sometimes placed in temple tanks or ritual basins. These helped clarify muddy water by coagulating small particles into larger clumps. Zinc suspended solids more quickly. Modern science now confirms alum is a highly effective coagulant, and its use in ancient times likely originated through observation, as clearer water emerged wherever the stones were used. In regions of Central America, the sap of certain trees was mixed into water before rituals. These saps had natural antimicrobial and coagulating properties, though their chemical basis was unknown to ancient peoples. Symbolic versus practical filtration. It's important to note that not all religious water practices were aimed at improving water quality. In some cultures, clarity of water was symbolic, not scientific. But across cultures, a convergence often occurred. Symbolically clear water was visually clean. Visually clean water reduced disease. Reduced disease increased reverence for purification. This cyclical feedback helped create a long-standing cultural memory that filtered, settled or flowing water was better for body and spirit alike. Over centuries, this wisdom would form the backbone of future public sanitation systems long before the term filtration was ever coined. Enduring legacy. The sacred filtering of water continues even in modern religious contexts. Holy water in Catholicism is still often filtered and stored in specially cleaned vessels. In Hindu rituals, Ganga Jal, water from the Ganges, is filtered before being bottled and sent to distant regions. Islamic ablution areas in modern mosques feature high-grade ceramic filters and flowing tap water. Ensuring hygiene remains paramount. These practices are echoes, sophisticated continuations of a long, quiet history in which faith met filtration. Long. Before microscopes or purification tablets, ancient believers found ways to cleanse water, not just for survival, but for sanctity. And through these acts, they passed down systems that, without ever using the word science, upheld the earliest principles of it. While much of water filtration in ancient history stemmed from domestic needs or religious rituals, one of the most pressing and large-scale demands for clean water came from military operations and engineering marvels. Armies on the move, imperial builders and early infrastructure planners all required access to clean water across distances, seasons, and unfamiliar territories. Their solutions often combined practical ingenuity with surprising foresight. This section focuses on how ancient engineers, military leaders, and empire builders handled the challenge of filtering water at scale, especially when lives depended on it. The Roman military's approach to water purity. The Roman Empire is remembered for many engineering feats, roads, aqueducts, bridges, but one of the most understated elements of their success was their ability to secure clean water. Even while marching, Roman legions required potable water for drinking, water for washing wounds and bathing, water for cooking and preparing grain-based rations like pulse and porridge. To accomplish this, filtration with cloth and gravel, Roman soldiers often traveled with simple filtration tools. When collecting water from rivers or lakes, they might stretch woven cloth across jars to strain sediment. In some cases, leather satchels with gravel layers were used to screen out debris. Temporary aqueducts. In long campaigns, Roman engineers built temporary aqueducts or water channels to divert and filter water from nearby springs or higher terrain. These makeshift systems would often include settling basins where larger particles could sink before being passed downstream. Boiling and settling. Roman military manuals sometimes prescribed boiling water to reduce illness, especially after experiences during campaigns in North Africa and the Middle East, where stagnant water sources posed risks. After boiling, water was allowed to cool in open containers, allowing remaining particles to settle. Storage in ceramic amphorae. Soldiers sometimes carried water in amphorae, large clay vessels. The porous nature of clay allowed slight evaporation, cooling the water and occasionally improving taste. Some amphorae were lined with bitumen or wax to reduce contamination during long journeys. Camp planning around water access. One of the key reasons Roman camps were so efficiently planned was to ensure they were within range of a reliable water source. Streams were sometimes dammed upstream, creating small reservoirs with makeshift gravel beds that acted as rudimentary filters. Persian Empire, Khanate systems, and strategic filters. The Achaemenid Empire, 550-330 BCE, of Persia, developed advanced water infrastructure for both civil and military uses. Their most enduring invention was the Khanate, an underground channel system designed to bring water from aquifers to dry plains. Here's how Khanates were relevant to filtration. Subterranean design reduced contamination. Water flowed underground, through hand-dug tunnels, often shielded from sunlight and surface pollution. Silt reduction. Through stone-lined shafts. Periodic vertical shafts were constructed not just for maintenance, but also allowed for sediment collection. Gravity helped heavier silt fall to the base of these shafts, naturally clarifying the flow. Strategic access points for soldiers. Khanates often supplied water to military outposts and administrative centers. Guards were stationed to protect clean access points, ensuring troops didn't contaminate upstream flow through misuse. This large-scale water distribution was quietly filtered through thoughtful engineering, offering hydration to cities and garrisons across hundreds of miles of arid terrain. Macedonian campaigns. Alexander the Great's water strategies. As Alexander the Great pushed eastward through Asia, water logistics became one of the major constraints on his conquests. Accounts. From ancient historians like Arrian and Curtius Rufus detail how his engineers adapted. Water scouting. Specialized units scouted for clear-flowing springs or underground water tables. These teams were trained to identify water sources free from surface contamination. Canvas filtration. Greek forces carried coarse cloths and animal skins, which were used to filter water drawn from rivers or ponds. These were effective in removing organic matter and visible sediment. Settling amphorae. Collected water was often left to rest in sun-warmed amphorae, allowing particles to sink. Soldiers skimmed the upper layer for drinking, avoiding the sediment-rich bottom. While not as refined as Roman systems, these methods were essential to surviving desert marches and unfamiliar territories. Ancient Chinese military filtration in ancient China, especially during the Warring States period, 475-221 BCE, water logistics were recognized as central to warfare. Records from Sun Tzu's Art of War mention securing the cleanest upstream water source, poisoning or contaminating enemy. Water, a form of biological warfare. Constructing small bamboo filters in flowing streams. Some archaeological evidence suggests gravel-filled baskets were placed in rivers to act as early silt traps. Cloth-lined water jugs allowed sediment to be removed before use. Large ceramic storage jars with internal lip filters helped pour out clearer water from the top while leaving sediment behind. Furthermore, some Chinese armies carried dried herbs known to kill bacteria or parasites when boiled with water. An early form of infused purification, blending medicine and filtration. Water management in ancient fortresses and castles' military filtration wasn't limited to mobile forces. Permanent strongholds had to provide clean water year-round, especially during sieges. In ancient and medieval periods, fortress wells with sediment layers. Wells were often dug deep within castle walls, reinforced with stone and sometimes lined with sediment traps, channels that allowed silt to drop out of the supply before reaching the bucket. Rainwater harvesting with sand filters. Some castles used sand and charcoal basins to clean rainwater, collected from rooftops. Water passed through gravel, sand, charcoal layers before entering stone cisterns. Overflow channels and drainage filters. Cisterns included overflow spouts lined with porous rock or cloth, preventing dirty runoff from returning to the clean supply. In several Crusader castles in the Levant, engineers carved multi-tiered cisterns directly into bedrock. The first tier would collect water, the second would catch overflow, the third would allow sediment to settle. Only the fourth was used for drinking, a brilliant passive filtration design. Siege tactics and water contamination. Unfortunately, understanding filtration also led to its weaponization. In many sieges, wells were poisoned using decaying animals or human waste. Contaminants were dumped upstream from enemy camps. Rivers were diverted or dammed to force consumption of stagnant water. These actions not only starved cities, but created disease outbreaks that weakened defenders from within. In response, defenders often built sealed cisterns or adopted barrier filtration methods, such as cloth-wrapped intake pipes submerged in running water, preventing larger biological threats from entering. Water filtration in ancient construction projects beyond military needs. Massive construction required stable access to water, not just for workers, but for mixing materials like lime, clay, and mortar. In ancient Egypt, workers on temple projects used settling ponds dug near the Nile, where water could rest before use. Reed mats laid across intake channels, acting as filters to remove floating debris. In ancient Mesopotamia, builders used layered ceramic bowls with tiny holes at the bottom to let only clean water drip through slowly. Water filtered this way was used in crafting mud bricks, ensuring fewer impurities that could compromise building integrity. Timeless principles of ancient filtration. Despite differences in materials and beliefs, ancient filtration for military and engineering purposes relied on a handful of consistent ideas. Let water rest. Time allows particles to settle naturally. Use layers. Sand, gravel, cloth, stacked correctly, always improves clarity. Protect the source. Clean water stays clean when intake is managed wisely. Store smartly. Ceramic, stone, and even wood can prevent contamination when designed properly. Though these methods lacked modern germ theory, they often mimicked basic scientific principles that remain in use today. Whether marching into battle, building a temple, or defending a walled city, ancient engineers understood that without clean water, none of it could stand. Their humble, practical filtration systems, from cloth to clay, were quiet triumphs of observation, experience, and adaptation. While much of the ancient world approached water filtration from a practical or engineering standpoint, many societies also viewed water through a deeply spiritual and medicinal lens. The quest for purity wasn't always scientific. It was often ritualistic, symbolic, and steeped in belief systems that saw water not just as a physical necessity, but as a sacred element with healing power. And interestingly, These beliefs often led to methods of purification that had practical side benefits even before germ theory existed. In this section, we examine how people across civilizations filtered and treated water for religious, medicinal, and spiritual purposes, blending belief with practice in surprisingly effective ways. India, the sacred waters and early charcoal filtration. One of the oldest known water purification systems comes from the Indian subcontinent, particularly in relation to the Vedic texts and Ayurvedic medicine. Charcoal and sand in early writings. Ancient Sanskrit texts such as the Sushruta Samhita, circa 600 BCE, describe boiling water and filtering it through charcoal, sand, and gravel, one of the earliest recorded instances of layered filtration. These methods were not just utilitarian, they were spiritually endorsed. Water filtered through these means was believed to be sattvic, pure and life-enhancing. River Ganges and ritual cleansing. The Ganges River was, and still is, revered as sacred. Pilgrims bathed in it, drank from it, and even carried it in containers across long distances. While the river itself was not filtered traditionally, the act of prayer before drinking, combined with selective sourcing, e.g., upstream, moving water, often led to cleaner intake practices than seen elsewhere. Copper vessels. Another fascinating tradition involves storing water in copper pots. Ayurveda taught that copper imbued water with health benefits, particularly for digestion and immune strength. Modern science has validated this to a degree. Copper surfaces have antimicrobial properties that can reduce bacterial load over time. Ancient Egypt, priestly water filtration and temple purity. In ancient Egypt, water played a crucial role in religious rituals and temple ceremonies. Priests were known for their obsessive cleanliness, and their methods often doubled as early. Forms of purification. Filtered temple water for rituals. Before entering sacred spaces, priests would bathe and cleanse themselves multiple times a day. This required access to clean water, typically sourced from the Nile but passed through fine linen cloths, reeds, or sand traps before use. Stone basins and settling pools. Some temple complexes had stone-cut basins where water could be collected and left to settle. Any sediment would remain at the bottom while the upper layers were drawn off, a passive but effective filtration strategy. Perfumed and medicinal waters. Papyrus scrolls detail the use of herbal infusions and aromatic oils in water meant for offerings or anointing. While symbolic in intent, many of these mixtures included antimicrobial plants such as thyme, myrrh, or mint, adding an unintentional sanitizing effect. Mesopotamia, ritual purity and legal codes on water in the civilizations of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. Water was both a tool and a test of purity. Ziggurat filtration pools. High temples, ziggurats, often had constructed water channels leading to small purification pools. These were used by priests before ceremonies and were often layered with fine silt, clay, and gravel to cleanse incoming water. Water in legal practice. The Code of Hammurabi includes references to irrigation and water rights. While it doesn't mention filtration directly, it punishes pollution, suggesting a cultural awareness of maintaining water cleanliness. Ceremonial water use. Water from the Tigris or Euphrates used in rituals was often collected in specific seasonal windows when flow was stronger and contaminants lower. A protoform of timed water sourcing to ensure clarity and freshness. Ancient Greece, clean water for health and balance. Greek medicine and philosophy placed great emphasis on balance and moderation, and clean water was no exception. Hippocratic sleeve. Perhaps one of the most intriguing innovations was the Hippocratic sleeve, a cloth bag used to filter rainwater. Named after the famed physician Hippocrates, this method involved pouring water through the bag into a vessel, trapping dirt, sediment, and organic material inside, allowing clearer water to collect beneath. It was prescribed for use by the ill, especially when preparing medicated drinks or cooling agents. Boiling and cooling. Greek physicians often instructed patients to boil water, then let it cool overnight, skimming the surface before drinking. This removed floating debris and, as we now know, killed many pathogens. Cisterns in healing temples. In places like Epidaurus, where healing temples honored Asclepius, god of medicine, clean water was collected from springs, filtered through gravel-lined channels, and stored in stone cisterns. Pilgrims bathed in and drank from these before ritual dream sleep ceremonies. Mesoamerica, water and sacred plants. The Aztecs, Maya, and Inca all developed sophisticated relationships with water, some of which served filtration purposes as a side effect of ritual or agricultural practice. Terraced irrigation and sediment control. In the Andes, Incan agricultural terraces slowed water movement, allowing natural sediment settling before water entered lower fields or reservoirs. This passive filtration method was essential at high altitudes where clean water was limited. Sacred cenotes and selection rituals. The Maya treated cenotes, natural limestone sinkholes, as holy. Priests often tested water clarity and taste before ritual use. In some cities, cenotes were protected from human contact, preventing contamination and ensuring clean supply for elite rituals. Herbal additives. Both the Maya and Aztecs used bark, resin, and charcoal mixtures in clay pots to infuse water before ceremonial use. While intended as spiritual enhancements, these ingredients often had natural filtering or antibacterial properties. Hebrew and Islamic traditions, ablution and clarity water filtration, was central to daily life in Judaic and Islamic traditions, particularly in regard to ritual purity. Mikveh and settling pools. The mikveh, ritual bath in Judaism, required water that was naturally collected and clean. Rainwater or spring water passed through gravel and sand-lined channels into stone basins. Sediment was left behind, ensuring a clean final pool. Islamic ablution pools, wudu. Islamic architecture from the Umayyad and Abbasid eras features courtyard fountains and stone basins designed with overflow drains and sediment traps. The Quran encourages cleanliness, and classical Islamic scholars wrote about boiling water to remove impurities, storing it in glazed ceramic jars, avoiding stagnant sources, cultural norms, and health overlap. In both traditions, flowing water was preferred. Running water from springs or rivers was seen as cleaner, and indeed this reduced microbial risks, aligning belief with health-preserving practice. Shinto and water in Japanese tradition. The Shinto belief system in Japan emphasized spiritual purity, and water was at the center of its rituals. Chozuya, temizuya, basins. Found at the entrance to shrines, these were filled with freshly flowing spring water, often passed through pebbles or bamboo channels that filtered visible debris. Mountain springs and sacred cleanliness. Certain mountain springs were declared sacred and sourced specifically for ceremonial washing. Selection was based on clarity, temperature, and speed of flow, all of which correlated to better water quality. Seasonal cleansing rites. During misogi, participants would stand beneath waterfalls or pour buckets of water over themselves, but always from pre-cleaned or protected water sources, indicating an early system of intentional hygiene. Across civilizations, it becomes clear that ritual and reason often walked hand in hand. Ancient people may not have had microscopes or germ theory, but their reverence for water and their efforts to keep it clear, flowing, and honored often resulted in filtration techniques that were unexpectedly effective. These spiritual systems, in prioritizing purity, preserved health. Even today, echoes of those rituals remain. In copper bottles, herbal teas, blessed springs, and flowing fountains, reminders of a time when sacred and scientific were still the same thing. The story of how people filtered water in ancient times isn't just a string of disconnected methods, boiling here, sand there, a bit of cloth in one place and charcoal in another. It is a long and winding record of observation, experimentation, cultural intuition, and necessity. And even as we end this journey through ancient riverbanks, desert cities, mountain springs, and sacred fountains, one truth echoes quietly: clean water was never taken for granted. In this final section, we reflect on the forgotten innovations, the ancient genius hidden in everyday acts, and how those ideas survive in the DNA of modern water systems, even if their creators remain unnamed. Settling before science, the oldest and simplest method. The concept of letting water sit still to allow sand, clay, algae, or organic matter to drop to the bottom was used by nearly every ancient civilization. It required no tools, no heat, no special materials, just a still pot, time, and a watchful eye. Even today, modern water treatment plants begin the process with sedimentation tanks. These giant basins mirror the old stone cisterns and earthen bowls of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Mohenjo-Daro. Settling, despite its simplicity, works. Heavier particles drift down, lighter materials float, and can be skimmed off. In the ancient world, this was often enough to make water visibly clearer, and in many cases cleaner. Sometimes, as in Babylon, large settling pools were built at the end of canals. In Indus Valley homes, small clay jars with wide mouths encouraged settling and evaporation before drinking. These designs weren't accidental. They were rooted in observation: cloth, sand, stone, the first filters. The simplicity of filtering water through woven cloth remains deeply practical. It's how villagers across South Asia still strain water. And long before paper, this was likely the most common method, especially in regions without access to clean springs. In Egypt, finely woven linen cloth served both ceremonial and household use. In China, silk cloth was sometimes stretched across water jars. In Europe, coarse wool or flax cloths filtered out insects and algae. Some cultures discovered even better outcomes when water was poured through a sequence of natural materials: gravel, sand, crushed charcoal, and clay. Each layer removed more impurities. These were the ancestors of today's slow sand filters, still in use in municipal systems across the world. They rely not just on physical removal of particles, but also on the formation of a biological layer on top that digests contaminants. This process, strangely enough, was discovered by observation in the 1800s, but replicates what ancient water pots often developed naturally. Charcoal. The ancient chemist's secret, charcoal appeared across regions in both culinary and medicinal settings, but its use in water was particularly brilliant. In Ayurvedic medicine, burnt wood was soaked in water before drinking. In Japanese tradition, binchotan charcoal was placed in ceramic vessels to purify water. The Romans too discovered that certain types of charred wood reduced foul smells. in stagnant water. We now know that activated charcoal absorbs a wide range of impurities, including certain bacteria, toxins, and chemical residues. While ancient people didn't understand chemical bonding, they knew from practice that water stored in charcoal-treated containers tasted better and smelled cleaner. Even modern home filters, like Brita or Pur, use charcoal as a core component. A technology from thousands of years ago still sits in kitchen fridges around the world. Boiling, fire, and the mastery of heat. The act of boiling water is among the most consistent purification strategies observed in historical records. The Chinese boiled tea not just for taste but for health. Greek physicians recommended it for invalids. Nomadic tribes on the steppe boiled river water in metal pots slung over open flames. In Japan and India, it was often followed by herbal steeping, mint, ginger, fennel, which had secondary benefits beyond taste. What boiling lacked in elegance, it made up for in effectiveness. Modern science confirms that bringing water to a rolling boil kills bacteria, viruses, protozoa, and parasites, almost all major biological contaminants. What's remarkable is how common this method became even before microbial theory. The instinct to clean water through heat was likely developed from watching the sick become healthy, again and again, after drinking cooled, boiled liquid. Sacred belief, scientific benefit, as explored earlier, many methods of filtration were tied to religion or ceremony, but often carried real-world results. Water that had to be blessed or stored in copper was less likely to be scooped from dirty sources. Ceremonial water was usually drawn upstream before waste could mix into it. River offerings, especially in India or Mesoamerica, were poured only into flowing water, never stagnant pools. Even when ritual masked intent, the results were safer. Over generations, dangerous habits were filtered out, and safer customs remained. In some African traditions, rainwater was considered sacred and collected in sunlit clay jars. The sun's UV rays helped kill bacteria, while the porous jar allowed evaporation and cooling. Today, solar disinfection is a known method in emergency water treatment, a modern rediscovery of ancient common sense. Engineering marvels lost to time. Some of the most fascinating ancient water systems involved architecture and scale. Petra, Jordan, carved into stone cliffs. This city harvested rainwater through channels and sediment traps, directing it into massive underground cisterns. These were covered, sealed, and filtered through natural limestone, remaining potable for months. Minoan Crete, aqueducts brought mountain spring water to cities. Households had access to clean water, filtered naturally through mountains. Rock. Even the toilets were flushed with running water. Over 3,000 years ago, Teotihuacan, Mexico. This ancient metropolis managed water with canal systems, reservoirs, and filtration basins lined with volcanic gravel, which naturally trapped debris and microorganisms. Modern engineers study these systems today. What they find again and again is not primitive trial and error, but deliberate design informed by deep understanding of terrain, water flow, and human need. Lessons still flowing. Today, it's easy to dismiss ancient people as unscientific. But across millennia, they experimented, observed, adapted, and often succeeded. They learned which containers kept water fresher, which rivers stayed clean longest, which smells signaled danger, and which rituals, however mystical, led to fewer fevers, fewer deaths, fewer illnesses. Even now, billions of people worldwide lack access to filtered water. And in many of these places, villagers and families use the same ancient methods: boiling, cloth filtering, charcoal storage, settling jars, copper pots. Human ingenuity, when tied to survival, is hard to extinguish. Closing the circle from glaciers to streams, wells to jars, temples to toilets, the path of water through ancient civilizations was never taken lightly. They knew, even without knowing, that water could heal or harm, could quench or sicken, could sustain or destroy. And so they learned to filter it in ways both simple and sacred. Today our taps hum with chlorinated flow, and purification happens behind distant walls in vast machinery. But the principles remain the same. Let it settle. Let it breathe. Let it move. Let it be treated with care, because in every drop we drink is a memory of those who came before us with pots and cloth, fire and faith, filtering life itself. Good night.